Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for another edition of Texas Insider TV, brought to you by SpeedStream. I'm Jim Cardle. State Representative Joe Pickett represents House District 79 in El Paso and is currently chairman of the Border and Homeland Security Committee in the Texas House of Representatives. He is also past chairman of the House Transportation Committee, and with November's elections approaching, Proposition 1 on the ballot goes a long way toward addressing the state's future transportation, congestion, and traffic needs. With Texas A&M University recently releasing a study showing that Texans spend an average of 44 hours in traffic in our metropolitan areas, Texas is trying to tackle the issue head-on, and we're pleased to be able to visit with State Representative Joe Pickett about Proposition 1 on November's ballot. Chairman Pickett, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
As I mentioned, you've been chairman of multiple committees and serving our state for a significant period of time. Appreciate your effort in that regard. And now, today, we're talking about Proposition 1 on the November ballot in attempts to try and address some of our state's transportation problems. You're traveling the state. You had a hand in the legislation. But if I can first, just from a general, maybe 30,000-foot perspective, give us a bit of an overview. In your opinion, what is the exact funding problem in Texas? How are the dynamics coming together that we now have Proposition 1, if you would?
The dynamics about why we're in this position are twofold. One's very positive. The other one is not so much negative, but probably a reality check by the general public. The first one, the good one, is everybody wants to be in Texas. This is where businesses want to be. This is where people bring their families. The last census, we had more people come from California, move to Texas, than actual births in our state. So that's a good thing.
And of course they have to come through your hometown of El Paso.
They come through my hometown on Interstate 10. They also bring usually a car, two cars, or have teenagers or somebody driving. So we have almost as many registered vehicles in Texas as total population. And everybody knows there's children out there. They're not driving if they're under 16, but families have more than 1, 2, 3 cars. So that's the reason. One of the others, and I said it's somewhat negative, not really, but a rationalization that the money, the revenues that come into the state of Texas that we dedicate towards transportation infrastructure have not increased in decades and decades. Most people don't know that when they go to the gas station, the tax that they're paying is not like in the retail store, where it's a percentage of the sale. Okay. It's a flat 20 cents a gallon and has been the same since 1991. And out of the 20 cents, a nickel goes to public education. So 15 cents out of every gallon of gasoline goes towards transportation. But that's been for 23 years. It hasn't changed. Same amount of money.
So even for a cost of inflation check right there, it's probably at 20 cents today is doing probably a nickel or 7 cents worth of...
Absolutely. And the perception, though, by the public is when they see the gas prices go up, when it goes from $3.29 a gallon to $3.89 a gallon, they're assuming that we, the state government, is collecting more tax. We're not collecting any more tax, none whatsoever. So there's been an educational process to all this, letting them know that it's just not sufficient anymore. There's not enough money coming in, and the facts also show that people are driving less, and the vehicles they're driving, there's no question about this, are getting better gas mileage. So the average Texan is paying less today in gas taxes than they were 20 years ago.
I want to get to a couple misperceptions similar to that in a minute if we can, but first, continuing on this line, so you're saying we've got an increased use, increased population, the tax base is essentially staying the same, thus we have Proposition 1. Tell us, if you would, because I know it involves oil and gas and severance and people are concerned about the rainy day fund, but tell us specifically as much as you can, without getting into the weeds, what does Proposition 1 do?
Well, first off, the rainy day fund was created back in the 80s when the oil and gas production started coming on and was doing better than had in the past. The legislature came up with an idea of putting that money aside into a savings account. No one back in the mid-80s ever thought the money that we were going to dedicate to that savings account would be more than we ever needed. But because we created it constitutionally, the legislature just can't appropriate that money without the public's approval. So Proposition 1 is asking the public, before we make a deposit into your savings account, because the money is so much higher than it has been ever in the last 20 years, let us split it. Okay. We're going to go ahead and maintain a healthy savings account. We'll put half of it into the savings account and half of it now dedicated to transportation. And that's a wise use of their money.
So most folks are aware, if they've been in the state for more than the last couple hours, about the huge oil and gas exploration that's providing additional revenues to our state through the severance tax. And what you're saying is, based on that growth, which is projected into the future, a percentage will go aside. And again, I want to be sure and not necessarily pin you down, but assure folks the rainy day fund is still going to be protected and still continuing to grow based upon what the past performance.
Not only will it be protected, but in this constitutional amendment, because the discussion got to our savings account, we're now going to look at it every 2 years. We only talk about it once a decade or once every 2 decades, but because we're proposing this is where the money come from, we're now going to also have that discussion every 2 years. How much money do you and I think should be in that savings account? That was an added benefit to what we put in the enabling legislation for this proposition. So we'll be able to sit there and the legislature will look at it and ratify an amount that we need as a minimum here going forward.
You mentioned about the dynamics of how the split is going to be, or how it will be approved by the legislature every couple of years. And before we sat down, I think it speaks to the need, or is important for folks to realize, this is a constitutional amendment. That is not a typical or a simple thing to get on the ballot, and you had to work very hard. It requires 100 members of the House, which is 2/3 of the 150 members. Talk a little bit, if you would, about the process you had to go through and how that does speak to the need for Prop 1, if you can.
We either came close or broke the record in the legislature for the longest session. We ended our regular session without coming to an agreement on transportation funding. The governor called us in for a first special session. It blew up during that time. He called us in for a second special session. And again, a lot of legislators have families, have plans, left, went on vacation, putting their kids back in school. It didn't happen during the second session. But all of those time periods, Senator Nichols in the Senate, myself on the House, we're trying to get 100 members, the 100 right members. We need 100 that are supporting us to be there any one time. It took basically 8 attempts and 3 special sessions to actually get this passed. So it's not an easy feat. We did a lot of the groundwork by convincing. And the convincing wasn't as much as showing the benefits to members who now go back out to a very, very diverse state, and for the most part now are educating their local communities on the advantages. But it's very, very difficult to get a constitutional amendment, especially that has so many difficult details. Transportation funding is very confusing to a lot of people, and so it was not an easy feat at all.
Folks, I want to thank you again for joining us for this edition of Texas Insider TV. Again, we're talking with Joe Pickett, Chairman of the Homeland Security and Border Affairs Committee, but also past Chairman of the House Transportation Committee. Mr. Chairman, if I can keep going along that vein, because a lot of folks hear the politicking or the arm twisting or the convincing, but tell us, I know there was more to it than that, and I want to try and get you to specify, were there an example or two of specific cost-cutting measures or bureaucrat-cutting measures that were part of you convincing folks to vote for the Constitution?
Absolutely. I think the average Texan out there, if they're told what the overall budget is for TxDOT, there's just under 12,000 employees. They have a biannual budget of $20 billion. And that's still a lot of money to most of us, me especially. And so when someone says they should have enough money there, what are they doing? What is that agency doing to cut costs or any efficiencies? Well, in the enabling legislation, we said, you're right, put up or shut up. And the Department of Transportation is required in this legislation to find $100 million in savings, and not funny money, not on paper. They have to come up with real money, because the legislation says now that will be applied to the debt. And I know you talked about this with Chairman Nichols. We have a lot of debt regarding transportation infrastructure. This directly pays that down. And if you're somebody who's conservative, who cares about the amount of debt, how much debt service we're paying, we have more debt service than we pay right now than what we appropriate in cash for new construction. It got flipped just a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So that's a big point to a lot of people. You mentioned the rainy day fund. There were suggestions of how much should be in that fund. We don't talk about it very often. The fact that we're going to do this now every 2 years, and the legislature will set what that balance is going to be, that's a good discussion to have. Those are some of the things that we put in this to not just garner support, but answer the comments and questions that people had during the debate on this subject.
You mentioned a couple of the misperceptions, and I want to pivot a little bit if I can and wrap up and be respectful of your time. I know you've had a hearing earlier today, but talk about the economics of this if you can, just a little bit. I know you're in El Paso. There's significant Highway 10 runs from East Texas all the way to West Texas. There's Highway 35 going north and south. There's got to be some serious repercussions that Texas needs to adhere to a maintenance program. Talk about the importance of transportation.
There's a couple of thoughts there. First off, out of the total amount of money that we appropriate to TxDOT, the majority of it is not what your Chamber of Commerce is pushing for, a new overpass or widening of a road.
Okay.
We have to take care of what we have already built, and people forget that. We have a ribbon cutting, but that new road that we opened, that new overpass, that new bridge has a life expectancy. But the only reason it has a life expectancy is we have to pay for maintaining it for 30 or 40 years, and at the end of that period we've got a reconstruction. Other economic benefits are businesses in Texas. They're coming here, and they have been coming here in droves, but when they find out they can't get their products now to market, or they can't get their employees to the office where they build those widgets, that's a problem. And we've seen that happen in Central Texas. Where I live in El Paso, I give people an example. I'm so far west Texas. It's closer for me to drive from El Paso to San Diego than it is from El Paso to Beaumont, Texas.
Really?
I need that Interstate 10 between El Paso and Beaumont is more important to me than El Paso to San Diego. And if you take that example in the Panhandle, Central Texas, down South Texas, our strength is the fact that we can get these goods on the road. The jobs that this creates itself. Right now we're at the edge. What we didn't talk about was the debt that we have. We have so much outstanding debt, and people want to know, why didn't we hear about this crisis sooner? That's because we have been borrowing for the last several years to take up the gap, and we can't borrow anymore. And it makes good economic sense to stop borrowing, pay down our debt, put people to work, get folks on the highways, make them safe, get them to work on time. There's no downside to this whatsoever.
Well, speaking of common sense and good solutions, we're going to leave it there and put a stop to the debt and put a stop to this interview. Chairman Joe Pickett, we appreciate you coming in.
Vote yes for Proposition 1.
There you go. We appreciate it and hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
Folks, be sure and stay tuned for more information on Proposition 1, both from Texas Insider TV and other news sources across the state. Chairman Joe Pickett, Chairman of the Homeland and Border Security Committee, past Chairman of the Transportation Committee, will be traveling the state. We appreciate your time again.
My pleasure.
Be sure and join us for future editions of Texas Insider TV, where you're either an insider or you're not. I'm Jim Cardle. Thanks for joining us.